The Korean mafia boss believed no one could be trusted with his paralyzed son. That is why he turned his mansion into a high-tech fortress of hidden cameras. He had seen too many subordinates follow orders out of fear. And too many caregivers treat his son like a broken object. But one night, while monitoring the silent feeds from his private office, what he saw the new maid doing with his son made him stop breathing. It wasn't a breach of security. It was something he thought his son had forgotten how to do. His son was laughing. Han Yong had built an underworld empire on absolute suspicion, ruthless authority, and control. As a man who commanded thousands, he believed that any threat could be eliminated with enough power. Until the night the world showed him he was powerless. 3 years ago, a rival's pursuit ended in a tragic crash that shattered his family. Han Yong emerged with scars he could hide. Sun Young didn't. The accident left the boy paralyzed, his legs as still as the quiet mansion they lived in. In an instant, the fierce boss of the Han syndicate was reduced to a grieving father who could no longer fix his son's world. Since that day, his sprawling estate had transformed from a seat of power into a clinical prison. High-priced specialists arrived and departed in silence. Therapists followed rigid, joyless protocols. Nurses and staff moved through the halls like ghosts, serving a man they feared. Some were efficient. Others were careless. Han Yong had watched through his monitors as caretakers treated Sun Young with the cold indifference of someone handling a burden. And with every cold interaction, Han Yong's heart hardened further against the world. So eventually, he did what a mafia boss does best. He established total surveillance. Without a word to his staff, he embedded microscopic cameras into every room, hidden in antique vases, bookshelves, and shadowed corners. Not to protect his secrets, but to protect the only thing he had left to love. What he never expected was that a quiet woman with a plain resume was about to do something on camera that would shatter his belief that control was the only way to survive. To the outside world, the Han estate was a monument to the iron will of the syndicate, but inside, it was a tomb of silence. The transition had happened 3 years ago, on a night when the rain turned the soul asphalt into a mirror. Han Yong still remembered the sound of the metal shearing, a high-pitched scream of steel that ended with his world upside down. He had pulled himself from the wreckage with nothing but scratches, but when he reached for Sun Young in the back seat, the boy's eyes were open, yet his legs were already drifting into a permanent stillness. Since that night, Sun Young had become the broken heir. The boy who once practiced taekwondo with fierce intensity was replaced by a shadow who sat by the window, staring at a garden he could no longer run through. Han Yong, driven by a mixture of agony and the ruthless pragmatism that made him a boss, threw money at the problem. He hired the most expensive physical therapists in Asia, men and women who arrived with prestigious degrees and cold, clinical hearts. Han Yong watched them through the pinhole lenses hidden in the crown molding. He saw a renowned specialist from Zurich sigh with visible irritation when Sun Young's muscles wouldn't respond to the electrical stimulation. He watched a therapist roughly adjust the boy's braces, her face a mask of boredom as she checked her watch, treating his son like a piece of faulty machinery rather than a child. Another woman, hired for her supposed gentle touch, would speak to Sun Young in a high-pitched, condescending tone, only to scowl the moment the boy turned his head. Each time a caretaker failed to see the soul behind the disability, Han Yong's heart grew more guarded. To these people, Sun Young was a lucrative contract or a tragic burden. They saw the wheelchair, the gleaming, motorized cage, but they never saw the boy who used to love the rhythm of the rain. Han Yong fired them all, one by one, his office becoming a graveyard of discarded resumes. The mansion grew colder. The staff learned to walk on eggshells, fearing the boss's silent, watchful eyes. Sun Young stopped speaking altogether, retreating into a fortress of monosyllables and downward glances. Han Yong realized that while his power could buy the finest medical equipment and the most secure surveillance, it couldn't buy a reason for his son to smile. He had built a world where his son was safe, but in doing so, he had accidentally built a world where his son was alone. It was into this atmosphere of polished marble and unspoken grief that the new maid was scheduled to arrive, carrying nothing but a small bag and a question no one had thought to ask in years. The morning Christina's black arrived at the estate, the sky was a bruised gray, matching the heavy atmosphere of the house. She stood at the massive iron gates with a single bag, looking small against the stone pillars that usually intimidated the most seasoned criminals. When the head of security escorted her into the main study, Han Yong did not look up from his monitors. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he used to break the nerves of his subordinates, but the woman didn't fidget. She stood with a calm, grounded posture, her eyes tracing the rows of leather-bound books rather than the cold, sharp man behind the desk. When Han Yong finally turned his chair, he fixed her with a gaze that had made men plead for their lives. He expected her to look at the floor or stammer through a greeting. Instead, Christina met his eyes with a steady, quiet dignity. He flipped through her resume. It was thin, lacking the high-tier credentials of the nurses he usually hired, and he let out a short, cynical breath. He detailed the rules of the house with a voice like grinding gravel: no unauthorized visitors, strict adherence to the medical schedule, and absolute silence in the East Wing. "My son is not a project," Han Yong said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He is the only thing that matters. If you fail him, or if you treat him with the slightest bit of impatience, you will find that I am not a man who gives second chances." It was a threat that had sent previous candidates packing before they even saw the guest house. Christina didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging a weather report, and waited for him to finish. When the silence returned, she didn't ask about her salary, her time off, or the terrifying reputation of the Han Syndicate. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and asked a single, unexpected question: "Does Sun Young like music?" Han Yong paused, the question catching him off guard like a physical blow. He thought back to the boy before the accident, the one who used to hum along to the radio in the car, but that memory felt like it belonged to a different life. In the 3 years of silence that followed the crash, no one had asked about the boy's soul, only his spine. "He doesn't like anything anymore," Han Yong replied coldly, turning back to his screens to signal the end of the interview. Christina didn't argue. She just tucked her bag under her arm and followed the butler out of the room. As she walked away, Han Yong watched her on the office monitors, a tiny figure moving through his vast, surveillance-heavy halls. He felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, not trust, for he didn't believe in that, but a strange curiosity. She was the first person to enter his fortress who seemed more interested in the boy's heart than his father's power. For the first week, Han Yong stayed away. He submerged himself in the jagged, violent world of the syndicate, orchestrating shipments and settling territorial disputes with a cold efficiency that left his rivals trembling. He treated the new maid like the ones who had come before, a ghost in the periphery of his vision. He avoided the monitors in his study, fearing he would only see more of the same, the clinical silence of his son's isolation and the mechanical movements of a stranger doing the bare minimum for a paycheck. But on a Tuesday night, driven by a restless surge of fatherly guilt and the lingering memory of the woman's odd question about music, Han Yong sat in his darkened office and toggled the switches on his console. The screens flickered to life, bathing his face in a ghostly blue light. He bypassed the cameras in the East Wing and the foyer, clicking through until he reached the wide-angle view of the kitchen. What he saw made him lean forward, his fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany desk. It was nearly 8 o'clock. According to the strict schedule he had authored, Sun Young should have been in his bedroom, finishing his evening studies or staring at the ceiling in his usual catatonic silence. Instead, the boy was in the kitchen. He hadn't touched the dinner tray resting on the counter, but he wasn't retreating either. His wheelchair was positioned near the pantry, his head tilted slightly to the side, his expression uncharacteristically alert. Christina was there, her back to the camera as she moved between the stove and the sink. She wasn't performing the chores with the brisk, silent resentment Han Yong was used to seeing. She was moving with a soft, rhythmic sway, and then the audio feed picked it up, a low, melodic humming that seemed to vibrate through the speakers of the monitor. It wasn't a song Han Yong recognized, it was a soulful, wordless vibration that felt ancient and warm. Han Yong watched, mesmerized, as Sun Young's hand, usually balled into a tight, frustrated fist on his lap, slowly relaxed. The boy's fingers began to tap a phantom rhythm against the armrest of his wheelchair. He was lingering, drawn to the sound like a traveler to a campfire in a dark woods. Christina didn't turn around to acknowledge him, nor did she snap at him to return to his room. She simply kept humming, her voice rising and falling in the quiet room, creating a bridge of sound in a house that had been silent for 3 years. For the first time since the accident, Han Yong didn't see a broken air on his screen. He saw a curious child, caught in the gravity of an unexpected kindness. The following evening, the surveillance feed from the kitchen didn't just capture movement, it captured a transformation. Han Yong sat in his leather chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in his dark eyes, watching a scene that defied every rule of his household. The dinner trays had been pushed aside, and the sterile, white marble island had been stripped of its formality. Christina was sitting on the floor, not standing, not serving, but eye level with Sun Young. In her hands, she held 2 simple wooden mixing spoons. Beside the boy, she had arranged a collection of stainless steel pots and overturned copper bowls like a makeshift percussion kit. Han Yong's first instinct was to reach for the intercom to reprimand her for the mess and the indignity of the display, but his hand froze when he saw his son's face. For the first time in 3 years, the boy's eyes weren't vacant. They were wide, tracing the rhythmic movement of Christina's hands. She began a slow, steady beat, tapping the edge of a stockpot with a hollow thrum. She didn't ask Sun Young to join, she simply invited him with the rhythm. After a few moments of hesitation, Sun Young reached out, his thin fingers trembling as he gripped a spoon. He struck the copper bowl. The sound was sharp and discordant, but Christina immediately incorporated it into her beat, nodding her head to the timing. The kitchen, once a place of silent, mandated meals, began to echo with a primitive, joyful noise. It was a kitchen concert, a chaotic and beautiful rebellion against the tragedy that had hushed the house. As the tempo increased, Christina began to play the pots like a virtuoso, her laughter bubbling up in the audio feed. And then, it happened, a sound that cut through the cold air of the office like a ray of light through a storm. Sun Young laughed. It wasn't the polite, forced sound he sometimes gave his father. It was a deep, breathless convulsion of genuine mirth. He hit the pots harder, his face flushed with the exertion of the rhythm, his disability forgotten in the sheer, percussive energy of the moment. Han Yong watched as his son, the boy he thought was broken beyond repair, leaned back and roared with delight at the clatter of the falling spoons. The Mafia boss felt a strange, sharp ache in his chest. He had spent millions on the best equipment and the most secure environment, yet it had taken 2 wooden spoons and a woman who wasn't afraid to sit on the floor to bring his son back to life. He sat in the silence of his office, his power feeling suddenly hollow, as he watched the screen and listened to the most beautiful music he had ever heard, the sound of his son finally being a child again. In the days that followed the kitchen concert, the surveillance monitors became Han Yong's private window into a world that felt increasingly like a fable. He found himself retreating to his office earlier each night, drawn to the flickering screens. He expected the novelty to wear off, but Christina's approach to Sun Young was not a series of tricks, it was an entirely different language of existence. One afternoon, the camera in the library captured them surrounded by a sea of old, leather-bound adventure novels. Previous tutors had brought dry textbooks and simplified worksheets, treating Sun Young's mind as if his intellectual capacity had withered along with his legs. Christina, however, was reading aloud from a tattered copy of an epic journey, her voice animated and full of grit. She didn't sit in a chair across from him like a teacher. She sat on the floor, leaning against the mahogany shelves, looking up at him as if he were the captain of the voyage. Han Yong watched as Christina paused the reading to spread a large, hand-drawn map across Sun Young's lap. She wasn't asking him to identify geographical coordinates, she was asking him to plan the escape. "The mountains are steep here, Captain," she said, her voice clear through the audio feed. "The horses are tired. How do we get the crew to the valley?" Sun Young leaned over the map, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. For the first time, his paralysis wasn't the focal point of his identity. In the world Christina created, he wasn't a victim confined to a chair, he was a strategist, a leader, a hero navigating impossible terrain. He began to point at the map, his voice gaining a strength Han Yong hadn't heard in years as he explained a tactical route through the Forbidden Pass. Christina listened with rapt attention, nodding as if his words were the only ones that mattered. She treated his decisions with the weight they deserved, never coddling him or offering the shallow, hollow praise that had characterized his sessions with the high-priced therapists. To the world, Sun Young was a tragedy to be managed. To Christina, he was an adventurer whose journey had merely taken a detour. Han Yong sat in the shadows of his office, his throat tightening. He realized then that he had spent 3 years trying to keep his son safe from the world, while Christina was busy giving the world back to him. She was feeding his imagination, reminding him that while his legs were anchored to the floor, his spirit was still capable of roaming across oceans and mountain ranges. Through the lens of the hidden camera, the Mafia boss saw his son's eyes shining with a light that no amount of his money could have ever rekindled. The stillness of the mansion was broken at 2 in the morning, not by a physical intruder, but by the raw, jagged sound of a human spirit fracturing. In his office, Han Yong was startled awake by an alert on his console. He quickly activated the East Wing feed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The infrared camera bathed the boy's bedroom in a ghostly, silver light, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Sun Young was not in his bed. He had dragged himself onto the floor, his useless legs tangled in the silk sheets like weightless anchors. The wheelchair had been shoved aside, overturned on its side, one wheel still spinning with a rhythmic, mocking click. The boy was striking the floor with his fists, his face contorted in a mask of agony that no amount of Han Yong's money could soothe. "I hate it." Sun Young's voice tore through the audio feed, cracking with the weight of 3 years of repressed rage. "I hate this body. I hate this chair. I want to be gone." He grabbed a glass carafe from the nightstand and hurled it against the wall. It shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds, mirroring the state of the boy's heart. Han Yong reached for the intercom, his fingers trembling, ready to rush in and wrap his son in a desperate, helpless embrace. But he stopped when he saw a shadow move across the doorway. Christina entered the room. She didn't turn on the overhead lights, keeping the space in the soft, protective dimness of the moon. She didn't gasp at the broken glass or rush to lift him back into the safety of the chair he so clearly loathed. Instead, she sat down on the floor, several feet away, letting the silence settle between his ragged gasps. "It's a cage," Sun Young hissed, his eyes fixed on the overturned wheelchair. "It's not a chair. It's a cage that tells the world I'm half a person." Christina didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell him he was brave or that things would get better. She simply looked at the overturned metal and spoke in a voice as steady as the earth. "Then let it be a cage for tonight," she said softly. "You're allowed to hate the bars. But the bars aren't what's inside, Young. The bars are just what's carrying the fire." Han Yong watched, breathless, as his son's shoulders finally slumped. The boy crawled toward her, collapsing with his head in her lap, his sobs turning from screams into a low, mournful whimpering. Christina placed a hand on his back, her touch light and undemanding. For the first time, Han Yong realized that his son didn't need a protector who could build walls, he needed someone who wasn't afraid to sit with him in the ruins of the ones that had already fallen. Through the monitor, the Mafia boss saw his own reflection in the dark glass, a man who had everything, yet knew nothing of the courage it took to simply stay in the room when the silence shattered. The following morning, the atmosphere in the room changed from the jagged edges of despair to a quiet, focused resolve. Han Yong, having slept only a few hours, watched the screen with an intensity that made his eyes ache. Sun Young sat in his wheelchair, his face pale and eyes rimmed with the redness of the previous night's exhaustion. Christina was standing before him, but she wasn't holding a book or a map. She was standing perfectly still, her feet shoulder-width apart. The accident took the connection, Young, she said, her voice carrying through the speakers with a grounded clarity. But it didn't take the memory. Your mind knows how a body moves. It just needs a mirror. She stepped forward, a slow, deliberate movement. Watch my weight shift. Feel it in your own hips. She moved with a rhythmic grace, exaggerating the lift of her heel and the roll of her toes. Left foot. The world meets you here. Han Yong watched as Sun Young's eyes tracked every inch of her movement. The boy wasn't looking at her legs with envy, he was looking with a strange, hypnotic concentration. Christina moved closer until she was inches from his chair. She took his hands and placed them firmly on her own thighs. Don't try to move your legs, she commanded softly. Just feel mine. Feel the muscle engage. Feel the gravity. Walk with me, Young. Use my strength to remember yours. As Christina began to march in place, a slow and steady cadence, Han Yong saw Sun Young's expression change. The boy's breathing began to synchronize with her steps. He wasn't walking, but his entire upper body began to sway in time with her. A look of profound realization washed over his face. He was closing his eyes, his fingers tensing against her legs, absorbing the vibration of her movement as if it were a lost language he was finally relearning. I can feel it, Sun Young whispered, his voice trembling. I can feel the floor. Your body remembers, Christina said, her own eyes shining with a fierce, radical empathy. We are just reminding it together. In his office, Han Yong felt a tear blur the image on the screen. He had spent years paying professionals to manipulate his son's limbs, to force life back into them through electricity and cold mechanics. But Christina was doing something far more profound. She was sharing her own vitality, offering her own steps to bridge the gap in his son's soul. In that moment, the Mafia boss understood a humbling truth. All his surveillance had protected the boy's body, but only Christina's compassion was capable of setting his spirit back on its feet. He watched them on the monitor, two figures bonded by a shared rhythm, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to believe in the impossible. The following morning, Han Yong sat in his study, the wall of monitors finally dark. For the first time in years, he didn't need the glowing screens to know what was happening in his home, he could feel the shift in the very air of the mansion. When Christina entered the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her, she didn't look like a woman facing the most feared man in the syndicate. She stood with the same quiet, unshakable dignity she had possessed since the day of her interview. Han Yong remained silent for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly on the mahogany desk. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she was the only person in his life who hadn't been intimidated by his power or bought by his money. I have spent my life believing that if I watched closely enough, I could prevent the world from hurting the people I love, he began, his voice raspy and stripped of its usual command. He turned a small dial on his desk, and a single monitor flickered to life, displaying a still image of the kitchen floor, scattered with wooden spoons. I saw everything, Christina. The music. The stories. The way you held him when the silence broke. Christina's expression didn't shift into fear or indignation. She didn't lash out at the invasion of privacy or plead for her job. She simply looked at the screen, then back at him, her gaze soft with a profound understanding. I hid these cameras because I didn't trust anyone, Han Yong continued, the words catching in his throat. I thought surveillance was protection. I thought my suspicion was a shield for my son. But watching you, I realized I wasn't protecting him. I was just presiding over his isolation. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders finally sagging under the weight of his own shadow. I am a man who can control an empire, yet I am ashamed that I had to watch through a hidden lens to learn how to be a father again. The confession hung in the air, a rare moment of absolute vulnerability from a man who had made a career out of being untouchable. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a fresh contract, one that offered her a salary 5 times her current rate and a permanent place in the estate. I don't want a subordinate anymore, he said, his voice steadying. I want someone who can teach me how to listen to the rhythm of this house. I'm not asking you to stay as a maid. I'm asking you to stay as his mentor. As a part of this family. Christina looked at the contract, then back at the man who had spent 3 years in the dark. She didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile. I don't need a contract to keep a promise, Mr. Han. I'm glad you finally stepped out of the shadows. The weeks that followed transformed the Han estate from a monument of stone and surveillance into a living, breathing home. The heavy velvet curtains in the east wing, once kept drawn to hide Sun Yung from a world his father didn't trust, were now thrown wide every morning, allowing the sole sunlight to spill across the polished floors. The high-tech cameras remained in their hidden alcoves, tiny glass eyes still embedded in the crown molding and bookshelves, but their purpose had undergone a silent revolution. Han Yong no longer retreated to his darkened office to hunt for negligence or betrayal. Now, when he flickered on the monitors, it was to witness the small, triumphant milestones of a life being reclaimed. He watched through the lenses as the kitchen remained a site of rhythmic rebellion, the sound of wooden spoons and laughter now a daily ritual that the rest of the household staff had begun to hum along to. He saw Sun Yung sitting in the library, not staring vacantly at the walls, but animatedly debating the next chapter of an adventure with Christina, his voice vibrant and full of the authority of a young captain. The broken air had vanished, replaced by a boy who understood that his value was not dictated by the mobility of his legs, but by the fire in his spirit. The change in Han Yong was the most profound of all. The man who had once ruled through fear and absolute control began to spend less time in the shadows of his office and more time in the light of the living room. He learned to sit on the floor, awkward at first in his expensive suits, as he joined the percussion sessions or helped map out imaginary voyages. He traded his clinical distance for a messy, imperfect presence, discovering that his greatest power didn't lie in his ability to watch, but in his willingness to be seen. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the mansion glowed with a warmth that had nothing to do with the heating system, Han Yong stood in the doorway of the kitchen. He watched Christina and Sun Yung sharing a meal, their conversation punctuated by easy, genuine smiles. He looked up at the corner where a tiny camera was tucked away, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to check the feed. He realized that while his wealth had built a fortress to keep the world out, it was trust and compassion that had finally let the world in. The mansion was no longer a cage of polished marble and silent grief. It was a place where the echo of a child's laughter was the only security he ever truly needed.